Okay, so welcome everyone to our book roundtable on Katie Stockdale's Hope and Oppression. My name is Jakob Huber, and I'm a political philosopher at Freie Universität Berlin, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion. So the event is actually hosted by Democratic Hope, which is a research group here at Freie Universität. And our aim in this project is to theorize the role and significance of hope in democratic politics. So I think it's very fitting that we will be hosting this roundtable on what's, I think, without a doubt, a major recent contribution to this still, I think, under-theorized field. So I want to say a word about tonight's format. We have invited 3 commentators to share their thoughts and questions about hope and oppression. So each of them will speak for around 10 minutes, followed by a response from Katie. And that should hopefully leave us with about an hour or so for a discussion with the general audience. So we hope for an informal and constructive discussion that hopefully gives us lots of insights and impulses to take away. So before I say a few introductory things about the book, I want to briefly introduce the participants in the order in which they will speak. So first of all, Claudia Blöser, she's a postdoctoral researcher at Goethe University Frankfurt, focusing on practical philosophy broadly construed, including the history of ethics, mainly Kant, moral psychology, and practical rationality. Antonine Lascelles-Webster is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of British Columbia, working on a thesis on the relation between hope and democracy. And David Owen is a professor of social and political philosophy at the University of Southampton, with wide-ranging interests from Nietzsche and post-Kantian critical theory to contemporary democratic theory and issues of migration and membership. Last but not least, of course, I'm very happy to be joined by the author of the book we're discussing tonight herself, Katie Stockdale, who is assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Victoria in Canada, with a research focus on the nature and value of emotions in moral, social, and political life. So let me say a few words about the book itself, by way of introduction. As the title indicates, Hope and Oppression is basically an attempt to think about systematically about the nature and value of hope under circumstances of oppression. And the main claim, I think, is essentially that profound injustices such as racism, sexism, and colonialism threaten the possibility of hope for those affected by it. But Katie Stockdale argues hope can also be regained even in the most desperate of circumstances if people come together in solidarity in order to resist oppression and act collectively in pursuit of a more just society. And in order to make this argument, Katie connects a variety of debates from moral psychology and the philosophy of emotions to social philosophy and analytical feminism. She situates hope between or within a network of closely related emotions, such as anger, bitterness, faith, and trust. And she does all this while consistently connecting abstract philosophical reflection with numerous real-world cases and examples. So examples both from the history and from present-day politics. So I think there's much to be admired about hope and oppression. And it's, of course, also politically, I think, very timely in what many perceive to be a regressive political climate that gives very little reason for hope, particularly for the least advantaged in our societies. But I think the arguably most fundamental reason why this is an important book is that it actually, I think, achieves what very few books achieve, namely to substantively move the philosophical agenda forward. I think the philosophy of hope so far has often focused very much on the nature of norms of hope, nature and norms of hope in general. So typically focus on everyday kinds of hopes, such as the hope that the sun will shine tomorrow, or at least personal kinds of hopes, for instance, that I recover from a serious illness. And I think Katie shows that political life raises distinct normative questions that require additional theoretical resources from social and political philosophy. Questions, for instance, about the relation between hope and the social structures that we find ourselves in, or about the nature and importance of collective hope. So without further ado, let's get going as I hand over to Claudia Blöser, who will be our first commentator.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Katie, for this really wonderful and inspiring book, and Jakob for organizing this roundtable and for inviting me. I will share a presentation. Okay, so I will start with a very basic question: what is hope? And one of Stockdale's methodological commitments is that we do not need to provide a perfect theory of hope before starting to investigate the role of hope under oppression. In light of this, she provides a surprisingly rich characterization of hope. On her view, hope is a mental state that is composed of 4 key elements. First, the desire for an outcome. Second, the belief that the outcomes obtaining is possible but not certain. Third, seeing or perceiving in a favorable light the possibility that the desired outcome obtains. And fourth, an explicit or implicit recognition of the limitations of one's own agency in bringing about the hoped for end. The first 2 elements correspond to the so-called standard definition, according to which hope consists of a desire for an outcome and a belief that the outcome is possible but not certain. While many agree that desire and belief constitute necessary conditions for hope, it is generally acknowledged that they are not sufficient. Having a desire for an outcome and a belief that it is possible is compatible with despairing over the low probability of the outcome. A number of theorists have proposed a third condition in order to complete the definition. Stockdale advances an own suggestion, namely that hope involves perceiving the possibility of the outcome in a favorable light. She elucidates this element by drawing on the philosophy of emotions, in particular the analogy between emotions and sense perceptions. What I find problematic is the combination of viewing hope as an emotion along the lines of a perceptual model on the one hand, and accepting the desire and belief as necessary components of hope, that is, building on the standard definition on the other. In the philosophy of the emotions, the belief-desire model is largely considered outdated. Classical cognitivist approaches to the emotions viewed a belief as necessary component of an emotion. For example, the belief that the object is dangerous as a necessary component of fear. However, this view has met with criticism, and the perceptual theory of the emotions was developed precisely as one alternative. The most influential argument against classical cognitivism is the argument from recalcitrant emotions. One can have the emotion without holding the corresponding belief, and presumably without succumbing to an irrationality that is as grave as holding contradictory beliefs. For instance, one can fear a spider without believing that it's dangerous. The argument from recalcitrant emotions encouraged the idea that the cognitive content of the emotion must be represented in a mode different from belief, for example, in a perceptual way. For instance, in fearing, we perceive an object as dangerous, or in fearing, the object appears as dangerous. In an article co-authored with Michael Milona, Stockdale draws on the possibility of recalcitrant hopes as a counterexample against Adrian Martin's analysis of hope. She does not, however, consider the possibility that the argument from recalcitrant hopes could be used to object to the idea that a belief in the possibility of the outcome is a necessary element of hope. To be sure, whether such an argument can be made depends on whether the representational content of the perceptual-like element is the same as the content of the belief. And this is what Stockdale apparently does not want to commit to. On her view, the content of the belief involved in hope is that the outcome is possible but not certain, while the perception involved is that the possibility of the outcome is favorable. However, what does favorable mean exactly? We find more on the notion of favorability in chapter 2. Stockdale's original suggestion concerning the rationality of hope is to introduce the dimension of fittingness. If hope is an emotion and as such involves a way of perceiving the possibility of an outcome, hope is fitting if and only if it involves a correct representation of the outcome. Following Dahms and Jacobson, Stockdale holds that an emotion is fitting in shape if it correctly represents the features of its object, and it is fitting in size if it is felt to an appropriate degree. She claims hope then is fitting in terms of its shape, just in case the possibility that the hoped for outcome will be realized really is favorable, that is, both possible and desirable. This explication, however, suggests that the favorability just amounts to possibility and desirability. If this is the case, Stockdale's characterization of hope should be simplified. And there are two possibilities of doing so. The first is that the third element, the perception of the outcome as favorable, can be discarded since everything is covered by the desire and belief element. If hope is fitting in shape, just in case the outcome is desirable and possible, this means that hope is fitting just in case the desire and belief involved in hope are correct. Alternatively, the desire and belief elements could be discarded since everything is covered by the third perceptual element. Hope does not involve desire and belief, but instead a perception of the outcome as possible and desirable. As Stockdale points out in another publication, correctness or fittingness conditions tell us something about what hope is. A thesis about what hope is a representation of should align with judgments about when hope is fitting. That is, if hope is fitting, if the outcome is possible and desirable, hope will represent the outcome as possible and desirable. So this is somehow a critical note on her account of what hope is. And now I'm moving on to the question what it means to criticize hope as unfitting in size. Stockdale's thesis is that it can be unfitting to hope for strongly desirable outcomes that are highly unlikely to be realized. However, one might wonder what this criticism amounts to. Stockdale illustrates this dimension of assessment with the case of a job candidate's hope to be offered a particular position where the candidate's chances are 1 in 500. In this case, it would be unfitting, according to Stockdale, to hope strongly to get the job. Note that she wants to distinguish assessing hope as unfitting in size from assessing hope as leading to irrational actions or to epistemic irrationality. But if these kinds of criticism are not what is meant by criticizing hope as unfitting in size, I find the unfittingness objection somewhat elusive. Stockdale wants to tie her analysis to the ways in which we commonly assess people's hopes in everyday life. But do we really commonly criticize people for hoping strongly for unlikely outcomes, even if those hopes do not cause irrational actions or epistemic irrationality? After all, they are just hopes. Further, the claim that strong hope for unlikely outcomes is unfitting leads to tension in the case of hope for moral outcomes that are unlikely to be realized. Stockdale claims that hope for moral goals, in particular for justice, in the face of a low chance of success is morally admirable. However, if these hopes are at the same time unfitting in size, what does this mean practically? Should we work to overcome or revise them, even if they are morally admirable? And now to something completely different. In chapter 1, Stockdale introduces her conception of fearful hope, which is a form of hope that is especially common in context of oppression. Fearful hope is hope to escape a threat. This hope is based in a fear. On the one hand, it is formed largely because one fears something. That is, the content of one's hope must make reference to a threat. On the other hand, fear changes or shapes the phenomenological character of the hope, such that hope feels unpleasant. Stockdale's general idea seems fruitful, and my suggestion is that her analysis of the relationship between hope and anger also provides the resources to single out a specific form of hope that is especially salient in context of oppression, which I would call angry hopes. Stockdale argues that anger is very often coupled with hope for repair. That is, for example, the hope that a wrongdoer apologizes or that justice will prevail. There are close analogies to fearful hope, which is why one might call hope for repair angry hope. Just as hope can be based in a fear, hope can be based in anger. First, it is formed largely because one is angry about a wrong or injustice. Hope for repair, one might say, amounts to hope that one will cease to have reason for anger. That is, the content of one's hope must make reference to a reason for anger. And second, just as fear shapes the phenomenological character of fearful hope, anger does so in the case of angry hope. This kind of hope is not a pleasant experience, but rather an unpleasant one, because it is a way of emotionally responding to an injustice. So I would be just be curious what Katie says about this way of applying her own idea to the case of angry hopes. Now to her conception of collective hope. Stockdale holds that that necessary conditions, or perhaps necessary conditions for hope to become collective, are that the hope is shared by at least some others, that it is caused or is strengthened by activity in a collective action setting, and third, the reciprocal hopeful expressions of individual group members result in an emotional atmosphere of hope that extends across the group. My comment concerns the second condition. Stockdale requires collective hope to emerge from collective intentions and actions of the solidarity group. Note that this rules out collective hopes for outcomes that exceed the power of the group. That is, hopes where the group cannot do much to promote the outcome and hence cannot form a collective intention to do anything to realize the outcome. However, this exclusion is surprising in light of Stockdale's defense of individual wishful hopes in chapter 2. Coined by Victoria McGeer, wishful hope denotes hope where individuals passively await rather than work toward the fulfillment of their desires. While McGeer holds that wishful hope is always a form of hoping badly, Stockdale argues that wishful hope is not necessarily a bad thing in contexts where people reasonably believe that there's nothing they can do but hope that things will get better. This incapacity is often due to social, political, and economic circumstances, nothing that an individual should be blamed for. And this kind of hope might still be good if it is a remedy against despair. In light of this defense of individual wishful hope, one might ask why collective wishful hope should be excluded. To be sure, the condition requiring collective action to be the basis of hope fulfills an important theoretical function. It serves Stockdale to distinguish collective hope from hope alongside others. If one discards the collective action condition, one would need to account for the collective nature of wishful hope in a different way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's a lot of food for thought already. And we proceed to our next commentator, who is Antonine Lascelles-Webster. Antonine, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jakob, for the invitation and organizing. Thank you, Cathy Stockdale, for the book, and thank you all for being here. So I'll begin. I'll try to keep it not too long. So Hope Under Oppression is an inspiring, generative, and beautifully written book about the value and risk of hope, its connection to other attitudes such as anger, bitterness, and faith, and its differentiated experiences across social and political conditions. As Stockdale writes, one of the main challenges for the philosophy of hope is figuring out the value of hope for people as they navigate the unjust and uncertain world in which we live. As such, she proposed to de-emphasize the universality of hope, which figures quite heavily in our social and political imaginary of hope, and in a way kind of like contribute a little bit to, I think, the skepticism toward political and social expressions of hope. And she proposed instead to adopt a feminist perspective that emphasizes the relations in which people are embedded, including those that can hinder one's capacity to hope. This allows her to locate hope and its absence within the limits, constraints, and flaws of the social world. The originality and main contribution of her argument relates thus to her capacity to intersect the experience of hope with our varying and multiple experiences of the world itself, and which allows for varying manifestation of hope throughout the book. Claudia talked a bit about some, like fearful hopes and hope for repair, for instance. So by moving the inquiry to this intersection between hope and worldly experiences, Stockdale provides a rich analysis and a productive framework that contribute to a growing scholarship on the political and social dimensions of hope. For the rest of my comments, I want to focus mainly on this idea of collective hope, before then discussing a little bit more the questions of political judgment and public justification, and the role of imagination when we think about hope. So one important element in Stockdale's account is that hope implies the recognition of our limits as political agents to bring about desired hopeful ends. This limited capacity suggests a reliance on others and raises question about how these relationships take shape and who these others are. As hope operates in community, Stockdale articulates two distinct sets of relations that capture the difference between hoping alongside others and hoping with others. So the first one being individual hopes, which are mainly described and conceptualized in chapter 1 and 2, and collective hopes, which are presented in chapter 5. So with individual hopes, recognizing one's limits suggests the need to rely on others to achieve what one considers possible. This perception is mediated by the individual experiences and perspectives, which are shaped by social, economic, and political factors. Who can assist is then determined by the extent to which the relationship is characterized by trust or distrust. The last one being adequate under certain circumstances. But Stockdale also described in chapter 5 how hope can resist how people can resist despair by coming together in moral political solidarity and engage in collective action toward a shared aim. She used the example, for instance, of the Me Too movement. The second relation stipulates that hope can be collective, and Claudia just mentioned that in her comments, when it is shared by at least some others, when the favorable perception of the possibility of the hopeful outcome will occur results from collective action taken by the group, and when in turn these actions create this emotional atmosphere of hope across the group. However, as anger and bitterness have been discussed in chapter 3 and 4, in relation to hope, I would have been curious to hear more about the role of joy and practices of care in sustaining collective hopes under oppression. However, since the process of hoping with others under oppression is about a shared hope that is actually shaped by collective actions taken within the group, so the first and second conditions, I wonder if you could better understand it and in a way distinguish it by talking more about a hope that is co-constituted by the collective rather than shared. The notion of co-constitutions, I think, captures how collective hopes reflect the capacity of individuals to act in concert with others, translate a specific orientation determined by the group, and create new possibilities. By coming together, we can develop the necessary shared language to imagine and conceive possible futures, make sense of the present and its failings, and coordinate collective actions. In other words, collective hopes not only point toward new possibilities, but also structure the present, as they rely on the spaces created by individuals coming together for some form of justice. This idea of hope being co-constituted emphasizes the relationship between collective hope and the group, and suggests a continuous process of appropriation, shaped by the action taken by the collective. These actions are not only moving the group toward a collective future, but they are also re-actualizing both what is perceived as possible and who is perceiving it. So here, the fittingness of hope and who is involved are both important dimensions of Stockdale's argument. The emphasis on the actualization of collective hope, however, is significant for its political relevance, as there is no guarantee that the members of the group will continue to conceive of themselves as such over time. That's a point that Michael Mackenzie makes in a book about future publics. So what does collective hope entail? Stockdale provides a compelling argument about the distinctive phenomenological character of collective hope. She argues that collective hope is fundamentally different as it belongs to a group rather than reflecting individuals who happen to be sharing similar hopes. As such, it goes beyond the simple aggregation of individual hope. The merit of this distinction is that accounting for the different sets of relation on which hope relies on help us think about how hope can be sustained within a non-ideological system, since these different expressions can play different roles and reinforce one another at different moments. For instance, one might lack individual hopes, but then share in the collective hope. Similarly, individual hopes along with emotions like anger can motivate individuals to actively join with others and act in concert with them, generating this distinctively collective hope. In addition, acting in concert with others and fostering this collective hope can also strengthen one's sense of political efficacy, open new horizons, or changes one perspective in ways that shape, reinforce, or even redirect individual hopes. So regarding the structure of collective hopes, Stockdale notes that they required, notes on page 124 that they require contact and emotional convergence between individuals who are jointly committed to intending to pursue an outcome together. This account makes me think of a passage from Harvey Milk's Hope speech, in which hope takes a collective form when it implies seeing and coming together with other queer people. Milk argues that this hope cannot be experienced in isolation and emerges between individuals and connects them as members of a group. So, hoping with others in Stockdale's account suggests us a very interesting emphasis on visibility, and this entails both a spatial and temporal dimension. This connection, however, raises questions about the political practices and conditions that could help sustain collective hopes. While there is an emphasis in Chapter 5 on social movement and solidarity groups, can we think of structural conditions that could support these collective hope at a more systemic level? And then I want to move on to this question of risk. So collective hopes differ from individual hopes not only due to their phenomenological character, but also their political structure and orientation. As Stockdale notes, hope can be co-opted by individuals and institutions in position of power, which highlight the political challenge of delegating hope and translating it into social and political institutions. We can easily imagine how individuals can invest multiple and often diverging hope into a political figure and create expectation that will inevitably lead to disappointment. So Stockdale described on many occasions in the book how the politics and marketing of hope can be exploitative in reinforcing existing power structures and condition of oppression. This leads me to a question about the risk of collective hope, the risk of collective and individual hopes. Since the former collective hopes are grounded within a collective and reflective of their shared power, are the risks of co-optation in the political context similar to the ones of individual hopes, or are we talking about something different? Could it be that more disruptive and emancipatory articulations of hope have been undermined by the skepticism towards social and collective expressions of hope in politics, and a greater emphasis on a kind of hope connected to individual pursuit? I think that's a point that Gaston Hage, and the anthropologist, is making when he talks about about co-hoping. And lastly, I want to talk about two quick little things. The first one, the question of judgment. So Stockdale devotes chapter 2 on developing a first-person evaluative framework to assess hope, which also provides tools to assess hope in wealth of justice in chapter 5. For instance, she writes on page 72 about the importance of self-reflection and receptiveness to others' observations of hopes, to evaluate hope. But when it comes to collective hopes, how can individuals judge the fittingness of others' hope, and how can we translate this into a process of public justification? Similarly, how can we evaluate and assess diverging and competing collective hopes within society? And lastly, there is a world-building dimensions to hope, as it can generate new possibilities. This feature implies a certain degree of imagination, since it suggests contrasting the now with possible yet uncertain futures. However, what we perceive as possible is restricted or constrained by conditions of oppression and crisis, such as a climate crisis, which can then cloud our ability to project ourselves into the future. In that context, there is an interesting discussion in chapter 5 about the risk and benefits of modest versus utopian hopes. But I'll be interested in extending a bit more this discussion by including the role of imagination and the conditions that could help us, that could help imagination shape our capacity to hope, but also help us define or redefine the object that we're hoping for. So in conclusion, Stockdale argues that despite disappointment and continuous struggles, what is important is that we do not lose sight of where we have been, where we are now, and where we need to go. On page 187, this is a great and rich book that does exactly that by exploring both the pitfalls and possibilities of hope in ways that emphasizes its future-oriented dimension and its grounding in today's challenge where the ongoing are new. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonin. Great thoughts. And we now come to our third commentator, who is David Owen.
Thanks very much. So I share everybody's sense that this is a superb book. It's full of many things to think about, and I just want to sort of focus on three small points. So in the committal service of the Anglican Church, at the point at which earth is cast on the coffin, the celebrant says this: "In sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life through our Lord Jesus Christ, we commend to Almighty God our brother, sister N, and we commit her body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust." So we can, as Katie says, have wishful hopes. We can also have confident hopes. And if the Anglican Church is right, we can have certain hopes. So I simply wish to raise the question about whether possibility but not certain is actually an appropriate criterion for hope. Seems to me one can have certain hopes where the possibility is assigned a probability of 100%. Now, call this general feature of our relationship to our hopes, that they're wishful or confident or certain or something in between those different states, qualified hopes, in the sense that they affect the way in which we relate to the hope in question. So here I want to address Katie's reflections on the value and the risks of hope. And let me start by making two distinctions. The first concerns the relationship of my qualified hoping to my life. The second concerns the basis of my hoping. So reflecting on wishful hoping, Katie highlights the point that such hoping is one in which individuals take themselves not to have any ability to realize or contribute to the realizing of the hope in question through their own agency, and notes that this illustrates that wishful hopers are forced to rely on the agency of others, and this raises the potential danger of hope in which their hopes can be exploited. Now, I read wishful thinking slightly differently, as hoping where one can see no plausible path from where one is to the realization of the hope. One can still hope, since one takes it that the realization of the hope is possible. One just can't see a plausible route to it. Now, I take it that the key feature of qualified hopes then concerns the relationship in which one stands to the hope's potential for realization. So consider a context in which an oppressed agent has good reason to think that nothing they can do directly towards the realization of the hope can affect its realization. But they also have good reason to believe either that the privileged groups are likely to act deliberately in support of the realization of the hope. You know, they've all taken a pill that makes them just, okay? Or that structural features of society are pushing towards the realization of this hope as a byproduct of other social transformations. Okay, so think about the shift from feudalism to capitalism. That changed a lot, okay, with regard to realizing things that might have been purely wishful hopes previously. So in this context, the agent may have reasonably confident hope that the state of affairs they desire be realized, even if there's absolutely nothing they can do themselves towards that realization, or nothing directly anyway. So this point draws attention to the importance of the fact that the appropriately qualified form of my relationship to hoping can be grounded in different bases, and these have rather different implications for my own conduct in contexts where, for example, I can't do anything directly myself. So in contexts where the privileged group are going to act justly, well, then maybe, I should be cheering them on. In contexts where it may be a byproduct of structural changes, I should be, endorsing and supporting those structural changes. Sometimes, after all, the best way to achieve a goal is not to aim at it, but to aim at something different. It's worth noticing that the point about structural shifts, or the non-deliberate realization of goal, or what Hegel would have called the cunning of history, has a central role in modern doctrines of moral progress. From Kant, and then the essay Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View, via Hegel and Marx, to contemporary theorists of moral progress such as Habermas. And what counts as rational hope is likely to be conditioned by one's background picture of social and historical development. Now, one reason that might matter is that it situates the dangers of hope not only in relation to exploitation by others, but also in broader socio-cultural features of society and its reading of its history. Part of the importance of the Black Lives Matter remark, the system isn't broken, it was built this way, is precisely to draw attention to the way in which a dominant historiographical mode of relating to US history in terms of moral progress, as it were, served as a kind of excuse for white supremacy. The problem here is that the politics and marketing of hope, to which Katie points, may itself only get its traction against a background in which moral progress is regarded as history's default setting, and in which this assumption underwrites confidence in the standing of our contemporary picture of morality. So let me link this point to a second issue to which Katie draws attention, namely the point that recurrent emotional responses can overspill into dispositional moods that structure our perceptions of the world. This is an issue that she highlights with respect to bitterness and anger in articulating the relationship of those responses to hope, but without, I think, exploring the reasons that resisting one's exposure to bitterness and anger may also motivate resisting hope, or perhaps better, qualifying one's hopes significantly. The overspill risk she identifies is a risk that pertains to hope, and here we might usefully juxtapose her discussion of the contrasting dispositions of Patrice Kahn-Cullors whose activism is tied to a fundamental hope, a hope constitutive of her identity, that leads her to hold on to the hope in the face of racial injustice, because what else? And the response to her question, the response to that question, because what else, offered by Derek Bell's embrace of racial realism. The worry here is that the identity constituting hopes, which shape how we see and interpret the world, almost ineluctably do so in ways that are always at risk of leading us astray for the same reason that anger or bitterness lead us astray, namely that we start to interpret the world, as it were, predominantly on the basis of this disposition. We are, as it were, then insufficiently reasons responsive. And to the extent that that slippage occurs, we're exposed to the risks of anger, bitterness, and even despair. We interpret the world from a hopeful point of view, as it were, because we have this fundamental hope. Our chances of being exposed to anger, bitterness, and despair go up. So one final thought on this issue of hope's overspill is to stress again that this can be enabled and encouraged by our cultural outlooks, including our picture of morality. Thus, for example, for the ancient Greeks or Nietzsche or Bernard Williams, our entire ethical outlook and the history of historical progress to which in Kant, Hegel, Habermas, etc. it is bound, appears as one that facilitates a hopeful disposition by leading us to picture the world as in principle fully intelligible to us and receptive to our ethical purposes. This is not, in their view, a good thing. So Katie's careful reflections on hope's relations to bitterness and anger also lead her to reflections on despair and on faith. But I did wonder if this discussion missed what one might call the Du Bois moment, in which the motivation for struggle isn't hope or faith, but indignation. On this view, struggle matters not for its outcomes, welcome as any positive ones might be, but because for its role in sustaining the self-respect of the oppressed, of maintaining their sense of dignity, and of refusing to see themselves as the oppressors see them. This need not require faith in any of the varied guises that Katie carefully distinguishes, but rather just the recognition of a responsibility to ourselves as an individual or group to uphold and not surrender our dignitary standing as equals. Despair, after all, is not the worst outcome. The worst outcome is accepting the entitlement to superiority of the oppressors and feeling gratitude when they act towards you in ways that you should be entitled to. In despair, one has lost all hope, but what despair signals precisely is that one has not yet lost one's soul. Let me end with a feature of the book with which I was uncomfortable. And do so by providing a defense of the Turkish taxi driver discussed in her discussion of hope and anger, who complains again about the racism he's experienced, but although he identifies Trump as a racist, agrees with Trump's border policy on the grounds that illegal immigrants crossing the border are making life more difficult and unsafe for legal immigrants. Now, Katie argues that the taxi driver is basically either being a kind of cultural dupe, just absorbing Trump's racist rhetoric, and basically therefore rejecting and therefore arguing, agreeing with Trump's border policy is just an expression of racism or xenophobia. Or she's committed to a very strong claim about borders. So I don't think that there's anything irrational about the taxi driver's concerns, okay? It's straightforwardly the case that there is at least reasonable evidence that even if illegal immigration is mildly positive on overall economic effects, it's likely to most negatively impact the least well off. So for example, in Southampton, where I work, the rise of Polish immigration into the UK led a skilled bricklayer's daily income to go down from £200 a day to £80 a day. Okay, now it's not irrational for those bricklayers to kind of be against, as it were, people coming in competing for them. Okay, that's nor is it kind of racist or xenophobic for them to hold that view. Okay, so unless one holds the fairly radical view that any border policy, as it were, any restrictions on immigration at all are racist and xenophobic, then it's unclear to me that Katie is entitled to describe the taxi driver as exhibiting racist and xenophobic views. Now, I say this not because I think Katie should have been better informed about the economics and politics of immigration, but because I think that what's happened here causes us to miss something which is actually important for her argument. And what it causes us to miss is that the taxi driver's framing of the issue in purely, as it were, kind of national terms, in ways in which he doesn't have any kind of global frame in which he could recognize his solidarity with illegal immigrants, that framing is itself one of the harms of oppression. That those who are oppressed are, as it were, pushed by that fact of oppression to frame their concerns more narrowly, more immediately. And it is a genuine achievement for oppressed groups to move beyond such narrow frames. So it is not just a fact about the African American movement for racial justice that it has managed to preserve a much more global frame on racial injustice than just America, which for most of its history it has. It is a genuine achievement of that movement of oppression to, as it were, sustain that global frame and see the links between racial injustice in America and racial injustice elsewhere in the world. So I think that Katie's casting of the case of the taxi driver, although obviously I'm not going to disagree with her that, you know, anger can cause us to be misled in various ways, but I think it elides from our view a harm of oppression which is relevant to explaining the taxi driver's point of view. So I will end on that note. Thanks, it's a great book.
Thank you very much, David. So there's a lot on the table now as we proceed to Katie, who will try her best with the response. Thanks again for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Jakob for organizing, and to Claudia, David, and Antonin for their super helpful and thoughtful comments on my book. So I have a million things to say, but I want to leave time for questions and not spend all of this time talking too much. So I'll focus on just some of the themes and questions that emerged. And I'll start by addressing the nature of hope. So I think Claudia's suggestion that we might do away with the belief desire component of hope is actually quite promising. And it's true that doing so would bring hope more in line with how we understand other emotions. So I actually speculate something like this in a super sneaky footnote in the chapter on hope and anger. So I point out there that one difference in how hope and anger are typically assessed is that hope is often assessed for epistemic rationality, whereas anger is not. We don't use that language of epistemic rationality in assessing anger. So we typically talk about anger as apt or fitting or strategically rational, but not that it's epistemically rational. And that's because we might think of belief as being part of the cognitive base of anger, such as the belief that a moral wrong occurred. But we don't think that that belief constitutes anger or is part of anger itself. So in the case of hope, philosophers often say that hope involves belief, or that belief is a component of hope, or that it's an essential ingredient of hope. But this would be kind of weird if hope is an emotion. And I write that the difference between how we assess anger and hope raises the question of whether the belief in the possibility that a desired outcome will come about can best be understood as the cognitive base of hope rather than a constitutive feature. So I'm definitely sympathetic to the idea that we could give up the belief desire analysis. And I actually like Claudia's second suggestion about how to do so by showing how everything is actually captured by that perceptual element so that we don't need that belief desire analysis anymore. And I also agree that there's lots more to say about fittingness assessments, how they should go. But I do want to say that at least many of us have the intuition that something has gone wrong when we strongly hope in the face of terrible odds, like the job candidate who strongly hopes in the face of a 1 in 500 chance. So we worry about people having emotions that are too strong given the circumstances all the time. So we might be too angry about a minor slight or too envious of a friend's accomplishments. We might feel intensely guilty about only minor mistake. And the same is true for positively valenced emotions as well. So we might rightly worry that someone is far too proud of themselves for something that's only somewhat admirable, or we might say that a person is too amused by a mildly funny joke. So sometimes we have good reasons to work to overcome these emotions which seem too strong given the circumstances. Such as in the case of intense anger. So given the nature of anger, we might worry about its effects on people's well-being and their relationships, for example. In the case of hope, though, I want to say too that it's not clear that there's anything really to be done about unfitting pride or amusement in terms of strength in those cases, unless we know more about them. And in the case of hope, I think that we should just be careful about having strong hopes in the face of terrible odds because they're riskier than hopes which are more fitting. But people still might judge first personally that they need their strong hopes to go on. And I'm not sure that I see much of a problem with that. But I will say that fittingness caused me a lot of stress when I was writing this book. It was like one of the things that I was like, do I really have to revise fittingness again? So there's a lot more to say. And I think that there's probably ways of thinking about fittingness in terms of size and hope that I haven't thought of in the book. Okay, but one thing I wanted to do too is highlight the kind of bigger picture version of the evaluative framework that I defend. So assessing hope requires attending to people's social location, their first personal assessments of the value of their own hopes, and the conditions of privilege and disadvantage that bolster possibilities for hope or damage them. And all of this is true regardless of what precise theory of hope you think is right, or how, if at all, you think fittingness assessments apply to hope. So this is in part why I think the rationality of hope question might be best cast in terms of whether and how people can hope well, where hoping well is a practice, it's something that we do, and it's something that we can do differently depending on who we are and the circumstances in which we find ourselves. I also emphasize really early on that assessing hope and other emotions requires a kind of epistemic humility and caution about one's own identity, experiences, and social location, and how they limit the extent to which one can understand the emotions of other people and their value. So David's criticism of my reading of the Turkish Lyft driver drives home the importance of these principles, I think. Right, so I just want to accept here that David's read of the situation is right, that my own evaluative thoughts post-anniversary dinner in the backseat of a Lyft ride were likely uncharitable and dismissive. But whereas David's discussion of immigration policy helps us to see where my thinking and evaluating went wrong in this case, I want to just highlight why it went wrong. So it's likely, I think, that unconscious classist biases and stereotypes about what taxi drivers might know and think were in the background of my mind as I was listening to his angry remarks. And without a sort of David level sophisticated understanding of immigration policy and without relevant lived experiences and so on, it's possible that I was just not in a good position to be the anger evaluator in this case. But I do still think the general point that I was making there stands, that our fitting anger about injustice can be misdirected and incorrectly identify a person, group, or institution as responsible that's not in fact responsible. Okay, So let me address another concern David had in this section of the book on faith, that I seem to miss a form of motivation that he attributes to Du Bois and Coates. So as he puts it, on their view, struggle matters not for its outcome, but because of its role in sustaining the self-respect of the oppressed, of maintaining their sense of dignity and refusing to see themselves as the oppressors see them. But I actually think that this is intrinsic moral faith, or a kind of faith that living a moral life has meaning and value despite its futile effects on the world. So part of what the agent of intrinsic moral faith might take to be meaningful and valuable about struggle is upholding dignity and self-respect. And one can have faith in this meaningfulness of struggle without any hope or faith that struggle will lead to improvements or any kind of substantive change. So what I really want to make clear about faith in the context of struggle is that it doesn't have to be about things working out or people doing the right thing. It doesn't have to be about the outcome. It can just be a faith that what one is doing is valuable and worth it, even if the pursuit is bound to fail. Okay, so I now want to shift to talk about collective hope to address some of both Claudia's and Antonin's comments. In terms of the conditions for collective hope, it's true that I want to preserve the idea that a group must form around an end for there to be collective hope, such as the guiding ideal of justice in the context of solidarity. So I use the language of a collective intention, but I also really like Antonin's suggestion of collective hopes being co-constituted or co-created, that kind of language by the collective. So collective action settings provide an opportunity for collective hopes to arise, which depend upon the convergence of people's emotional states who are present and a kind of resultant emotional atmosphere of hope that transform the sense that I am hoping into the sense that we are hoping together. But note that we don't necessarily have to rule out the possibility of collective wishful hopes, or at least I don't think we do. So a group of people might come together and form the collective intention to place their trust in privileged groups and institutions to pursue justice, and to borrow some insights inspired from David. But without forming a collective, we don't have a collective emotion. So we might have a hope that many of us share, but we can share hopes without those hopes being collective, as when we just hope for the same thing. So we can all hope for our own happiness, or we might share the hope that humanity will overcome the crisis of climate change, but us sharing these hopes doesn't mean that our hopes are somehow collective. And I think this is an important move, since the language of collective emotion, whether it's collective hope, collective anger, and so on, tends to be used sometimes, I think, without specifying exactly what is collective about the emotion. So my analysis of collective hope tries to provide an answer here. It says that what's collective about hope and what's not easily reducible to the hopes of individuals is that emotional convergence and emotional atmosphere that emerges. Okay, and I think Antonin's questions and reflections about how collective hopes are sustained over time is really important. So in the book, as he points out, I use the example of the Me Too movement as a movement of hope for women. At the time of writing, that made sense. But just yesterday, right, so I don't know how many people were paying attention to social media yesterday, Men Too, hashtag Men Too was trending on Twitter after the announcement that Johnny Depp won his defamation suit against Amber Heard. So one opinion piece in the New York Times was titled Amber Heard and the Death of Me Too. So like many others, I'm sure I scrolled Twitter for a while and sat with my despair about where we've ended up. So Me Too was founded by Tarana Burke with the goal of helping women survivors, including young people, queer, trans, disabled, Black women and girls, and all communities of color. But then I think about Men Too, recent anti-abortion and anti-trans legislation, and the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on the most disadvantaged women. So it doesn't seem, this makes me think about the fragility of collective hope. So they're powerful when they arise, but sustaining collective hopes takes ongoing collective action and group resilience. And collective hopes, like individual hopes, are responsive to evidence that threaten the likelihood of their realization. So gender justice doesn't seem to be looking good at this moment, and it was challenged yesterday by what is arguably a kind of new collective hope, the hope of Men Too. and what this moment symbolizes for men who might be fed up with feminist movements. Okay, so this is all very bleak, and I don't think we should give Johnny Depp too much credit for the state of gender justice, but I think the case is at least helpful in thinking through the collective hope of Me Too as an example. And though I'm feeling pessimistic, I always like to end on an uplifting note. So today it's this, that hope isn't everything. So one thing I aim to do in the book was to show how people can go on without hope. So anger, bitterness, faith, courage, compassion, love, all of these attitudes and emotions can sustain us in different ways. So I hope that the book can also give us some of the conceptual resources that we might need to figure out how to respond to threats to our collective hopes at times when it might seem like we need hope the most. Okay, thank you.